If you like your antagonist more than your protagonist, you probably screwed up something in your story. I know that sounds like a terribly arrogant thing to say, but the thing is, the villain should never be the best part of your story, because that means a large chunk of what you've written is not that interesting and not as good as it should be. In a lot of stories, especially starter stories, people tend to write themselves in as the protagonist. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but of course, because we're boring writers, the protagonist is also going to end up being a very boring person. We might not be able to tell this since they're based on us and we're kind of biased. But I think to make up for it, we instinctively seek to make the villain as cool as possible. Somebody strong, driven, confident, basically the opposite of the hero in almost every way. And I must tell you, that is awful. You do not want to write a novel where the best part about your story is the person that gets defeated at the end, and it only appears in some parts of the story. Your hero should be way cooler than your villain. Of course, this doesn't mean that your villain should be an idiot. I don't think anybody likes that. But it does mean that your villain has to be complementary to your hero. Knowingly or unknowingly, villains are simps, because they don't exist for themselves. They exist for the hero. They're there so the hero can defeat them and look way better. So then how does this work? How do villains remain compelling even though they're basically just losers? And the answer lies in the fact that it's very easy to look awesome when you just walk into a room, kill everybody in a cool way, and walk away like a badass. In fact, villains always look so cool that people always try to balance it out by making them do stupid or terrible things, neither of which I think is very effective. It's just not a good strategy. Your villain should be cool, and not stupid. And to balance that out, you need a hero which is even cooler. The point a lot of people miss is that the hero and the villain are inseparable. They need to have chemistry. It's almost like romance in a sense. For your hero, the villain is going to be more important to their personal growth than every other character combined. The villain is the linchpin of the entire story. They're like the shadow version of the hero that the hero needs to defeat, or a dark side version, whatever you want to call it. Remember the Joker's words towards Batman.
You complete me.
Joker is actually an amazing example of a great villain. Not necessarily because he's cool, but because he exists for Batman. Something he even says multiple times. The Joker doesn't want anybody else to hurt Batman or get between the two of them, because he has a desire to kill Batman spiritually. He wants Batman to break the rules he operates by and betray everything he stands for. That is real victory to Joker, not killing Batman. And this goes for all villains. All villains want a spiritual victory over the hero. A first and very terrible instinct people have is that the villain is just the opposite of the hero. That's common, and you've seen it a million times. The hero is a strong, hulking beefcake, and the villain is some scrawny brainiac that ends up getting defeated. Conan versus the evil wizard. Sure, that can work, but is it really compelling? And if not, why not? I think the answer is that in those cases of opposites, nobody's really challenging the other person. Imagine a professional skater wanted to fight a chess player. Those aren't really sports that translate very well. You could find something else for them to do, or a different area to compete in, but if you want to stick to what they do, then you probably need a villain that's also a skater, one that's also a chess player. If there's really no point of commonality between your hero and your villain, it's almost impossible to make the story compelling. That's why survival stories are so simple in a way, because every skill suddenly becomes useful and everyone has the same goal: survive. If you're writing a sports story and your protagonist is a young woman who does boxing, it's obvious that the antagonist is not going to be some old man in a wheelchair who does birdwatching, right? You might think, yeah, that's super obvious, duh. But for some reason, people are incapable of applying this to fantasy and sci-fi. They will put a teenager with no skills whatsoever against some of the most powerful people in the world, or maybe the most powerful person in the world. And I know what you're thinking, okay? You might think, well, didn't that work in Star Wars? Isn't that just a basic hero's journey? And yeah, you're right, it did. But that's because Star Wars is a family drama. If Luke wasn't Vader's son, Luke would be dead, and the story would be over. Another thing to keep in mind is that your villain cannot be some irredeemable psychopath. That removes all tension from the story. Defeating the villain is not necessarily a physical challenge for the hero, but a moral and spiritual challenge. The villain needs to present a coherent enough point of view or worldview that it's almost tempting for the hero to accept it. If your villain is just monstrously evil and just enjoys toying with people, humiliating them, torturing them, killing them, there's really nothing he could say to the hero that would serve as some temptation that needs to be overcome. One mistake I see frequently, if not really all the time, is making a villain who's irredeemably evil and then trying to explain it away by giving their backstory. The problem is that doesn't really change anything in the present. The drama is still absent because there's really no way the hero would ever excuse any of the things the villain has done, regardless of what happened to them in the past. If the villain got kicked around as a kid, that's fine, okay? And it might explain why they kill people in the present, sure, but that doesn't change the fact that they're murderers. The only way that works is if the reason they're murdering in the present is understandable and compelling. Even if you came up with some contrived scenario, like the hero and the villain are twins that got separated at birth and the latter ended up in a bad place, or both got experimented on so the hero understands what the villain went through, the dramatic elements here aren't really all that strong. The hero might feel a strange sense of guilt, they might feel apprehensive, but it's missing that spark, that magic. In order to develop the special connection between the villain and the hero, they actually need to be kinda similar. Or at least similar in a way that's very particular to them. Going back to Batman and Joker, yes, it doesn't seem like they have much in common, but they actually do. 1, they both taken up new identities. 2, they both operate outside the law. 3, they're both ideologically driven. And this brings them way closer together than if they just happened to be long-lost twins or something. Think of a cop story. Would you rather follow around a cop going after mindless goons that are just hell-bent on violence and possibly so drugged out of their mind that they barely understand what they're doing? Or would you rather have a cop chasing a former cop or a corrupt cop? The latter is definitely preferable, and there are 3 big reasons why. Number 1, we know the villain is going to be competent. Number 2, we know that the hero and the villain are going to relate on a deep level since they've held the same profession. And number 3, the villain might make some very compelling arguments to the hero as to why he should join him. And that's just on the most superficial level. We could go even deeper in terms of character traits, shared histories, etc. This isn't to say that a story in which a cop goes after mindless goons wouldn't be entertaining. I'm not saying that at all, but it's just a very different sort of story. That would work for an action movie in which the drama doesn't really matter. And that would probably also work if you were writing some super deep character study in which the real antagonist is how grimy and senseless the world is and full of violence and blah blah blah. But we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about how to write a very good villain. You can also make a story compelling if the hero has a particular value or trait they're hyper-focused on. Imagine your hero prided themselves on their rationality above all else. Now, question, do you think it would make a compelling narrative for them to go against a person that's completely irrational? No, obviously not, because they have nothing in common. Again, this would work fine if you're just writing some sort of character study and you were just observing how the protagonist interacts with these sorts of people. But if you're writing a story with a villain in which the villain plays a central part, then the villain and the hero need to be compatible. They need to be able to click. Would the hero be challenged by dealing with a person who's deeply irrational? I don't think so. Maybe their patience would be challenged, but that's about it. No, to be truly challenged, what the hero would need is to go against a person that's trying to adhere to rationality even more than they do, and who tries to dispel the hero's values. Imagine that our hero is hyper-rational, but they still have a strong sense of justice, a sense of love, personal connection, etc. The problem with the villain could be that they take it even further, and use rationality to try and dispel things like love and justice. And if the hero can't argue their point, then they're going to be forced to choose. What matters more, sticking to their image as being hyper-rational, or sticking with their loves and values? That's a compelling moment of character growth. And you need to remember, the villain wants the hero to agree with them. That isn't just some tactic they're using to try and disarm the hero. The defeat the villain seeks over the hero is always spiritual, first and foremost. We need to remember that no matter how cool the villain looks, they're always triggered by the hero on a way deeper level. Going back to the good cop, bad cop narrative, a good cop might be deeply bothered by the existence of the bad cop. It might be morally taxing to stay good, it might be tempting to go bad, it might create a lot of tension and drama, but fundamentally, the existence of the bad cop isn't a threat to the good cop. It is at most an inconvenience. This, however, is not even remotely true for the bad cop. Because the bad cop is coping, and because the bad cop thinks that they just had to go bad, because things were out of their control, because it was just a natural choice that anybody else would make. The self-worth of the bad cop is intrinsically tied to the good cop also going bad. Because if they don't, if they stay good, then that's proof that the bad cop isn't some super cool villain who just did what was necessary, but a weakling who gave in. Barring a few exceptions, like villains who are actually deluded or actually psychotic, which by the way I don't think would make super compelling antagonists for the types of stories we're talking about, villains are incredibly strong but broken and hollowed out. Most of them are dead inside and barely keeping it together. These are not masters of the universe, these are masters of coping, of pretending they're not actually as miserable as they are and bottling it all up. So of course seeing a person that's similar to them, especially if that person is weaker, sticking to the values they once held as well, is going to be extremely triggering to them. The villain is terrified of the hero succeeding and doing well because that says terrible things about themselves and their own failures. They're at the top of this tower built of black pills, and all it takes to have it crumble down is just one stubborn white pill, the hero. Yeah, the hero might be a little bit dumb, and they might be a little bit silly, but they're driven and they have willpower, something the villain does not have. As I said, the villains are usually hollowed out people. They're doing what they're doing because there's nothing else for them to do. I mean, Darth Vader is not going to wake up and suddenly turn to the light side. Maybe deep down inside he wants that, but it's always going to take a Luke to get him to take the plunge. Because again, a lot of villains are cowards. These are usually people who have fallen from grace, who have made terrible mistakes, but who are unwilling to admit that because that would mean conceding their weakness. All that coolness and badassery is just a mask, and there's really not much of substance underneath it. Their strength and power is really all they have in their main coping mechanism. And again, villains are simps. It may appear that the villain is trying to kill the hero, but that's rarely true. On some level, every villain wants to be proven wrong and defeated. They either want a chance of redemption, or at least the knowledge that with their passing, the world is going to heal and become better again. Because yeah, as cliche as it might sound, the villains are just deeply misguided, miserable people looking for a way out. If your villain has no inclinations of these sorts at all, and no real regret about being a villain deep down, no self-reflection to speak of, no insecurities, then you don't really have a villain. You have a monster. And make no mistake, villains and monsters are completely different, and you should use them in very different sorts of stories. With a villain, the main character builds a personal relationship to them, the villain is all up in their face, it's very dramatic. Monsters are nothing like this. They're detached, they're cold, they're indifferent, they're primal. Even if you're talking about a character who's a human, they're still fundamentally primal in a way in which only a monster could be. For example, a villain might kill people because they feel wronged, or because they feel it might lead to a better world. A monster is thoughtless in that sense, because they don't kill people for a reason, they kill them because it feels good. They might justify killing people in the same way you might justify why you like chocolate. Yes, you can rationalize it, you can give reasons for it, but fundamentally, they're just monsters in human skin who enjoy tormenting and killing others for their own personal enjoyment. If you're writing a nihilistic story about how existence is ultimately without meaning, then yeah, a monster is going to work fine. In fact, it's going to work far better than the villain, because the monster, again, doesn't really have any reason for doing what they're doing. They just are that way. If you want a genuinely heroic story, the villain has to be redeemable on some level, maybe in death at least. But they can't just be monsters who fully accept being psychotic murderers. You know what that sort of character would do? They would snap the hero's neck without hesitation the first time they meet. They are ruthless. Of course, it goes without saying you can have villains which are a little bit of both. I think Anton from No Country for Old Men is a good example. Yes, he's ruthless. Yes, he's a monster. But he does seem to have some values he believes in. At the very least, you could say he operates by certain principles, which he adheres to as well. But obviously, this isn't an ordinary sort of villain. In fact, he's rather unique. People like Anton and Hannibal Lecter are popular exactly for that reason. They're very interesting. But keep in mind, what makes monsters like these function in certain scenarios is that they adhere to certain principles which the hero can try and navigate through. The only way psychopaths can work as villains is if they have very strong values or very strong principles. And yes, these values and principles could be bizarre. But hey, your hero might be a weirdo too. Obviously, I focused on a very specific angle in this video on how to write a villain and how to get it right. But I do think a lot of the pointers I gave would be valid regardless of whether you're writing a cop thriller or an epic fantasy. I'll say it again, heroes and villains just can't be that different. The best way to think of a villain is as a fallen hero, or better yet, the slightly different fallen version of your own hero. Now, it's true, not every single one of them is some knight that wants redemption. Mr. Smith wants to be right.
Why, Mr. Anderson? Why? Why do you persist?
And he hates Neo because he proves that human willpower and spirit is a thing, and that kind of repudiates Smith's entire existence and worldview. So yes, you have the freedom to make it more philosophical in spirit and less personal, especially if your villain isn't even human. But remember that even in these scenarios, your hero needs to be an existential threat for the villain, in a way that is not the case for the hero. It's not that the hero is going to kill the villain, it's that something in the hero's way of being fundamentally disproves an assumption made by the villain. It would either shatter the villain's worldview or their self-image, and both are intrinsically linked. If the hero snapped their fingers and the villain disappeared, that'd be great for everybody. They'd go back to living their best lives. But if somebody did that to the hero, the villain would be pissed. Because the villain will be left questioning whether they're as wrong and as inadequate as the hero made them feel they could be. And the only way to disprove that for themselves is by breaking the hero, the source of this pesky feeling. And yes, that might require physical elements, but most of this is really happening in the spiritual dimension. The villain needs the hero to fall to their level. Emphasis here on fall, and I think the image of the villain as a satanic tempter is a very useful one. The villain is in hell at all times, and yes, this might be mental hell of their own making, but they still want to drag the hero down into it with them. And the villain needs to understand the hero and relate to the hero because these arguments need to be persuasive. And keep in mind, some of these arguments might be completely correct. But again, it's not about that. The hero is not heroic because they're right. The hero, as I said, could be a complete idiot. But the hero has willpower, and they have values, and they're going to stick to them no matter what happens. And it's precisely that willpower that the villain wants to undermine. That's what it's all about. The villain is fundamentally insecure. That's why they threaten. That's why they make arguments. That's why they try to cajole. That's why they tempt. They have no willpower of their own, and they know it. People will talk like a hero going against the villain is a battle of good versus evil. But it's not. It's a battle of wills. Who has one and who doesn't.